Welcome. My name is Troy Dixon. I'm the pastor of Normandy Park Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. And again, it's a privilege to have you with me today as we are continuing our study through the book of Habakkuk. We are at chapter 2, verse 6 down through verse 8. We actually begin kind of a new section today in this great book of the Bible. When I was a kid, probably junior high school or so, here in Jacksonville, we had a major phone company, Southern Bell, that later became Bell South, that later was absorbed into AT&T. And when I was in junior high school, the Bell South built a new office downtown, built a skyscraper. I don't know, it's 20, 30 stories tall. It's one of the largest, tallest buildings in Jacksonville. Had an aunt and uncle that both worked for Bell South, and so one day we were downtown, and of course you couldn't come right up on it, but we went past what really is a city block that was taken over for this new building. Everything on the block was removed, and at this point they were digging the foundation. Now, I had an understanding of what a foundation was for a house and understood how houses were built upon them, but I had never seen one for a skyscraper. It was amazing to me. As we drove as close as we could get, you could see, because of how large it was, you could kind of see over the fence and see the hole that was going to be the foundation for this skyscraper. It was massive. It was stories and stories and stories deep into the earth, probably several hundred feet deep. I had no idea then of how tall the building was going to be, but as time has gone on and I've kind of grown up and matured and understood some things, that foundation had to be deep, had to be strong to be able to support that building that was going to be built upon it. Foundations are a lot like roots for us. The root of a tree is going to determine the nature of the tree. The root feeds it and strengthens it and helps it grow. In many ways, in a emotional kind of spiritual sense, the foundation is the same thing. What we build our life upon is going to determine what our life becomes. It's going to feed us, it's going to nurture us, it's going to help us grow. Well, the book of Habakkuk deals with the nation of Babylon. At this point, the Chaldean people have not really become a nation yet. They're going to, and they're going to be God's instrument of punishment upon the Jews for their sin. But at this point, they have not completely developed. And yet God is already prophesying through Habakkuk their eventual destruction. The reason he does that is because the foundation that they're building their community upon, it's a foundation of idolatry. It's a foundation of violence. It's a foundation of carnality in that they live to just simply satisfy their pleasures and their desires. It's a foundation of theft and exhortation. This new section that we're moving into, the balance of chapter 2, is divided into 5 parts. Each of those 5 parts begins with a word. Each of those 5 parts is an indictment that God is bringing against the Babylonians. The word that sets them off, the word that kind of brings the division, is the word woe. Little, small interjection. It's used 50-something times in the Old Testament. It's used a number of different ways, but the 2 primary ways that it is used, it is an expression of pain. Not so much physical pain, but emotional and spiritual agony. And then it's used, as it is in this book, to announce destruction. It's a word that means or kind of depicts the idea of being undone. Everything is falling apart. Everything is just kind of unraveling. The one who cries out, woe, they're expressing that their heart has just fallen, that their spirit has fallen, that they see no hope of moving forward. That's the pronouncement that God has upon the Babylonians. And we're going to begin to look at why he pronounces that upon them. What foundation were they building their empire upon? So begin with me in verse 6 and let's read down to verse 8 of Habakkuk chapter 2. Shall not all of these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, Woe to him who heaps what is not his own? For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly rise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnants of the peoples shall plunder you. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell on them. Well, let me just kind of give you some notes on the passage and point out some of the visual imagery that the Lord uses in this passage. Bit of an outline first. There's an announcement in verse 6. Woe to him who reaps or who heaps up. He heaps up what is not his own. It is theft. He loads with pledges is not he has taken security from alone. It's those nations that he has forced into paying tribute. It's basically extortion. There is woe because they have been stealing and extorting other people. And then there's the threat in verse 7. The debtors will suddenly rise. Those who have been exploited are going to turn the tables upon you. Those that you have knocked down are going to rise up again. And then the reason is given in verse 8. For you have plundered many nations. You have degraded humanity. You have taken advantage of your power and your strength, and you have hurt people without reason. In time, Babylon was going to be held accountable for their sin against God and their sin against humanity. But that wasn't going to happen before there was much pain and much strife. Their punishment would come, but it would come in time. I want to read you a quote. This is a quote that Martin Luther King Jr. used in a speech years ago, but he was actually quoting a pastor from the 19th century. The pastor's name was Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker wrote, he said, Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross. But that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. Yes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Let me say that last part again. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I would tell you it bends because God bends it. That God takes our universe and he eventually directs it all towards justice. The Lord allows events to play out. He allows the sin that we prefer over his righteousness. He allows that sin to bear its fruit, and then that fruit to nourish us in unrighteousness. We chose sin over holiness. We chose sin over a Savior. And sometimes God will allow us to have our fill. But he is holy. And he is just. And he always brings about his holiness and his righteousness in time. God will not allow sin to go unchecked forever because God is holy and is just. And so we now have the perspective of time where we can sit and we can look at Habakkuk as he is prophesying on behalf of the Lord what was going to happen, and we can look and we can see that certainly a century or so later, exactly what Habakkuk had prophesied came to pass. The Babylonians themselves would one day experience God's holiness and justice. Let's talk about that issue of justice for just a few moments. I can literally tell you that justice is one of God's top 3 issues. For example, there's a verse in the book of Habakkuk that I love. Habakkuk, goodness, I'm mispronouncing everything now. The book of Micah. Micah chapter 6, verse 8. It says, "He has told you, O man, what is good." Pause right there for just a moment. I love these verses. I love these verses where the Lord is so crystal clear and says, here is what is important. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? To do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. A couple years ago, there was this, and it's still an ongoing conversation, there's this ongoing conversation about social justice. Now, if you just stop and you look at those 2 words and you put them together, you would say, that is certainly something that the Lord is interested in. He is interested in justice, and He is interested in our social relationships. He is interested in that those of us who have maybe power, those of us who have influence, those of us who have authority are to be responsible for those who may not have as much themselves. That we should treat people with dignity, we would treat people with grace, and we should treat them just. Well, social justice has been twisted in our culture today. And it's twisted to be something that's really not justice. The idea is we're protecting those who are less fortunate, but what has happened is become perverted. And instead of helping those who are less fortunate, we're trying to hinder those who are successful. That we're trying to dictate in our culture the outcome, that everybody should have the same thing, everybody should arrive at the same place. That's just not humanly possible. Every one of us is different. We have different strengths, different weaknesses, different resources, different experiences. We're not going to all end up with the same outcome, but we should all begin at the same place. We should all have the same opportunities. In a land of plenty, everybody should have the opportunity, if they choose it, for themselves. Well, biblical justice points to everybody being treated the same way. Not that necessarily everybody's going to have the same outcome. God made Solomon the wisest and the richest man who ever lived. God made Abraham probably the richest man, or one of the richest men of his day. Job was one of the richest men of his day. But not every saint of the Old Testament received that same checkbook and bank account. But God treated them in the same way, with the same grace and the same love. So a couple years ago, I did just a cursory read through of all of the minor prophets. I didn't read Isaiah and Jeremiah and such, but I picked up with Micah and Habakkuk and Jonah, all the minor prophets, and I read through all of them. And I didn't spend time interpreting everything that took place. I read through it with the idea that I wanted to see what was God condemning. What was the sin that God was calling Judah and Israel to task for? Prophet after prophet after prophet, one of three things, and sometimes all three, showed up. Church, it was so apparent that there was almost no other sin that was mentioned. I mean, these three things showed up time and time and time again. So let me give you the list real quick. The first one was idolatry. Over and over again, God spoke against the idolatry of the land. Now, Judah and Israel kind of vacillated back and forth between different forms of idolatry. Sometimes they would reject the worship of God almost completely. to where they had to go in and clean out the temple and rediscover the Word of God. They had completely abandoned authentic worship. Most of the time, they didn't abandon the worship of God. They would still go to the temple and they'd still offer the sacrifices and do all those types of things. But in their idolatry, they wanted to worship other gods as well. They wanted to worship the Baals. They wanted to worship at the Asheroth poles at the same way, at the same time that they were worshiping Yahweh. God rejected that. God will not be second fiddle to anybody. God will not share the throne with anybody. We worship God, and we worship God alone. Now, the second major sin that the Jews were condemned for was finding security in the relationships, the treaties that they were establishing with the other powers of the world at that time. Israel is in an interesting place geographically. If you ever look at a map of the ancient Near East, you have the Mediterranean Sea to the west, you have Asia to the east, Europe to the north, and Africa to the south. And that's a broad picture. That's the general idea of what you're looking at. Israel is the crossroads of the world. Basically, if you want to go from Europe into Africa, if you wanted to carry your goods from the Mediterranean into Asia or any combination of that, you almost always had to go through Israel. Now, there's two benefits that came from that. First off is it made them very wealthy, because people would come through there in these international trade routes that kind of made like a little pound sign on the nation, roads that went north and south, roads that went east and west. And so they had the opportunity to help transport goods. They had the opportunity to tax the goods as they came through there. They had the opportunity to make a lot of money, and it could make them a very wealthy nation. The second, and I think the more important reason that they were where God placed them where He placed them, is that as the world passed through Israel, they would find out about the one true God. They would discover this people that were holy, that were priests unto God. And they would find out the truth about the God who created them and loved them. And so their very placement turned them into, or should have turned them into, an evangelistic nation. Well, instead of depending upon God, they found their security in Egypt and the treaties that they had with Egypt. Or they found security in the treaties that they had with Syria or Assyria or later Babylon. They found their security and they found their strength in the relationship they had with the nations around them instead of the relationship they had with God. They weren't to be isolated unto themselves, but they were to trust God. And in trusting God, they were to be an example to the world so that the world would come to know the God that created them and loved them. That third problem that God pointed out over and over and over again was the problem of justice. To build their house, to build their nation, to build their business and their strength, the Jews over and over and over again were guilty of taking advantage of the weak, the people that they felt like were unimportant. They were guilty of taking advantage of the powerless. It was injustice. I say that because I want you to know that God values justice. God values how we treat other people. He expects us to treat each other with grace and with power, with purpose and with dignity. Last time I told you a story about these two deacons, the wise deacon and the harsh deacon. Let me tell you this story about two preachers that I've known over the years. One that I know very well, one that I didn't know quite as well. The one that I didn't know quite as well, he kind of offended me, to be honest with you. He kind of made me mad at times. church I served before I was in Jacksonville was in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and we had an association. I think there was 80-something churches in the association. A wonderful association of churches, great churches in that area. And Tuscaloosa, Alabama is just like Jacksonville, Florida, just like every other city in America. The majority of our churches, Baptist churches, and I would imagine this is the same for all the other Protestant denominations, Methodist churches and Presbyterians, Assemblies of God. Most churches are small churches. I don't remember the exact number, but 80+%, maybe 90% of churches run about 100 or less in worship on Sunday morning. And the classification for a small church is still a church, I think, that runs around 250. 250 or less is considered a small church. Up to, 500, 600, 700 is considered a medium-sized church, and then about 1,000 or more is considered a large or a mega church. Vast majority of the churches are smaller churches. And so we would have this associational meeting, and on Mondays we'd all gather together and be a time of prayer and sharing back and forth, just a time of encouragement. You had a busy Sunday, and now it was kind of a day to kind of catch your breath and such. And so I would go to these meetings, and I enjoyed them. Great fellowship time, hanging out with other pastors. Most pastors are pastors of smaller churches like I am, but we had some pastors that were of larger churches there in the Tuscaloosa area. Great men of God, loved the Lord. We had this one pastor that kind of came in. I'd been in Tuscaloosa for a couple of years, and he began to lead a church that was near us, maybe 5 miles from our church. And when he first came, I gave him a call, said, hey, welcome to the association, welcome to the community. Let's go to lunch and get a chance to know you and get you to know and a couple other pastors. And we all went, and he was nice. But I noticed that we would have these associational meetings, and he would kind of come in and look around the room and then just kind of hang back a little bit. Didn't really get involved in conversations. Didn't reach out and connect with folks. And we'd kind of talk to him, but we remained aloof a little bit. I thought, well, maybe he's just a shy person. Imagine that, a shy pastor. But then I began to realize that when the big fish walked into the room, and I use that term facetiously, when the pastor of a large church walked in, this old boy lit up like a Christmas tree. Hey, bud, how are you doing? The big handshake come out. God bless you. Glory to God. All that kind of stuff. When it was small church pastors, he didn't have much to say. When it was large church pastors, he was Johnny on the spot. I knew this other preacher. He'd been in the ministry 40 years. He pastored for 30 years, and at that point he was teaching pastoral ministries at the college I attended, Bible college. And he'd been doing that for about 10 years, and he was still doing interim pastorates. And I mean, he knew everybody from North Alabama to South Georgia to South Florida. Just a great, wonderful man of God. When I was in Bible college, we had chapel Monday through Thursday. Had a class at 8 o'clock, had a class at 9 o'clock, and then at 10 o'clock, from 10 to 10:45, almost 11 o'clock, was a chapel service. When you're doing chapel 4 days a week, it's tough sometimes to find enough preachers to fill the pulpit. So sometimes we had faculty that would preach. Sometimes we were blessed. Pastors of large churches in the area, Pensacola and Jacksonville and Atlanta, would come and would preach in chapel and just pour into these young men and young women that had been called to ministry. Awesome, wonderful servants of God. Sometimes we would have seminary presidents that would come and that would preach in chapel. Sometimes we would have our state convention leaders would come and preach in chapel. And I began to realize that when the pastor of the large church, the pastor of or one of the state convention leaders or the presidents of a seminary would come, our chapel would be standing room only. Students would just fill that place, hanging on every word and trying to meet them and to get to know them. But when it was faculty, their professor that they heard, every day, when it was a local pastor, a pastor from out in the middle of nowhere, pastoring a church of 50, 60, or 70, just fighting against sin and corruption, doing everything he can to win that little community to Jesus Christ. When it was a pastor that wasn't on the magazine cover, that wasn't on television, our chapel service, our attendance would be 50%. And you can get you a pew and just kind of spread out a little bit and enjoy the day. Unfortunately, it was the same with some of our professors as it was with some of our students. Celebrity was there, they were there. If it wasn't a celebrity, they were grading papers. Except for our pastoral ministries professor. Jerry Windsor was in chapel, in the balcony, on the front seat, every service. I worked for the AV department, and I would be in the room behind him videoing it and running the soundboard with a couple other guys. And Dr. Windsor was there for every preacher that came through. I remember one day, and I don't remember how the conversation came up, if he brought it up or if one of us brought it up, but this conversation came about his commitment to chapel. And he said, I'm not really impressed with celebrity. He said, there's some wonderful, godly men in large pulpits, large churches. And he says, there's some guys, but they're not. He said, there's some wonderful, godly men in small churches. And there's some guys that are not. He said, this is a decision that I made years ago. If God has called this man to serve him, and God has placed him in this pulpit to preach his word, God has a message and God has a word for me that day. And he said, when I go in with that heart and with that attitude, he says, God always speaks to me. Two different preachers. One that was fascinated with prestige and with celebrity. One that was fascinated with God. What is the foundation that you're building your life upon? A part of that foundation is to be justice. And that justice is seen in how we treat people. Babylon treated humanity based upon what they could do for them. And when they couldn't receive anything from them, they cast them aside or they tore them down. So let me give you some ideas. Treat people with dignity. Every person that you see, every person that you come in contact with, whether it's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, whether it is a politician, whether it's a sports figure, an athlete or celebrity, or literally whether it's the vagrant that is walking down the street pushing a shopping cart that hasn't had a bath in 5 days. God created every one of us in his image. He created us with purpose, with value, and because of that, everyone should be treated with dignity. It doesn't mean that we approve of what they're doing or how they're conducting themselves, but the person should be treated with dignity. Second thing, treat everyone with grace and with as much understanding as you can marshal up. That we should always withhold whatever kind of insult or attack that we feel we want to share. That we should treat them with grace, treat them with understanding. Treat people as valuable. Not because of what they can do for you, but because of how God has created them. Let the foundation of your life be that you treat people in the same way that Jesus treated people. That regardless of nationality, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of position, he loved them. And he sought to make their lives better. Normandy Park, you were missed. and you are loved. God bless.